Cool. So let me just set a stopwatch and we will start. So yes, hello everybody. I am Panos. It's very, very good to be here. Thank you for organizing this. Thanks to Kathy for the fellowship, obviously. Before I start, I just want to talk to you for 1 minute about the Interregnum Collective. It's basically an autonomous collective that we have started, aiming to make social theory accessible to people. Aiming to make social theory accessible to people who are not academics, aiming to sort of promote the radical imagination. We agree with Mark Fisher's sort of general argument about capitalist realism, the fact that we're living in a society which increasingly makes alternatives seem impossible and beyond the realm of imagination. So the Interregnum Collective, which Kat here has also contributed to, has just relaunched after 3 years of being dormant. We have a website. We're going to be making various events in Glasgow and in many other cities around the world. The first event in Glasgow that we know of is an anti-fascist hip-hop night on the 30th of November in Block Plus. But I really encourage you to check out the website, and if you want to write or contribute, we are open and we are accepting contributions, whether that is in the form of physical events or that is in the form of writing or anything else that you want. So that's my little promo out of the way, and we can start. So at some point in 2014 or something, obviously I had just come to the UK to study because I couldn't stay in Greece because of the Greek economic crisis, which is something that is experienced by many Greeks. And obviously I had to work to fund my studies because I don't have a rich dad or a rich mom. So I found work in an employment agency, through an employment agency. And we will talk again quite a lot about these amazing organizations. This was in a print factory, and I was immediately positioned alongside many other migrant workers, mostly from the EU, mostly from Eastern Europe. Hello, please come in. And we were working night shifts, 12 hours, from 6 in the afternoon to 6 in the morning. And obviously this work was intensely precarious, intensely exploitative, extremely tiring, etc., etc., etc. Now, one of the instances that I want to mention, which got me thinking quite a lot, is the fact that I very quickly realized that they were stealing half an hour of our wages. In the contract, it said that we were going to be paid, that we had 1 hour break. The break was half an hour for a 12-hour shift, but we were still being deducted 1 hour's worth of pay. So I started speaking to people and saying I had some contacts with trade unions, etc. That was in Bradford. And I started speaking to people and saying, look, you know, this is very easy to win. This is a situation which they are blatantly stealing our wages. We have the contract. It's very easy to prove that, you know, what is happening. And it was incredibly frustrating for me to see that nobody wanted to actually pursue this. Everybody had sort of accepted this for very many reasons. So I started organizing in Bradford, trying to bring migrant workers together and set up autonomous like trade union formations. And that proved incredibly difficult. So I started trying to understand what are the barriers to migrant worker unionization and organization in the UK. This is basically the start of what became a PhD and various other attempts, which included obviously physical organizing. Today I will be focusing explicitly on the more concrete aspects of my research. My research covers subjectivity, it covers wider theoretical questions of organizing, social movement theory, etc., etc., etc. However, because this is the socialist movement and theory network, I will focus on the issues that directly impact organizing based on what I have seen. And if you want to chat more about, theory, subjectivity, whatever, we can do that later. So let's go. The key points that I want people to keep, which we will sort of be turning back throughout this talk, is that I found that precarity induces a specific form of socialization that destroys the potential for the emergence of solidarities and organized resistance. So I'm looking at when you are employed in an intensely precarious occupation, what happens to your brain, what happens to your body, how does this destroy solidarities amongst you and your colleagues. For migrant workers, this is obviously exacerbated through various juridical, cultural, spatial, migration-related factors, which we will briefly touch upon. But this is common, I think, to all precarious occupations, to various extents. I also found that oppression and exploitation can be reconfigured into sources of pride that workers identify with. So I found that it's not enough to simply address a worker saying, "You poor thing, you are being very exploited, come and organize with us." Things are much more complex. I also found that common class position and common migration status are not enough for establishing solidarity. This is something that's been established by theorists of intersectionality, black feminism, etc. for many, many decades. But yeah, it was confirmed. And I also found that absent an inspiring narrative that is accessible, this is very, very important, the issue of accessibility, the socialization of precarity, this is what I call it, the socialization of precarity will proceed unencumbered. So I just want you to keep these points as we proceed. So, obviously, some context. As most of you here probably know, the UK's economy structurally depends on migrant labor. Anderson and Roos have done a lot of work on that. The fundamental book is Who Needs Migrant Workers? I encourage everybody to read it. I will skip through the context a little bit simply in order to move on, because these are things that most people already know, I believe, in this room. Obviously, migrant labor in the UK is structured by pre-existing imperial relations. Satnam Virdi from sociology has written an important book about this. All of this happens within a wider context of systemic racism and intensified border controls that produce precarious workers. So border controls are productive. They are not only repressive. They actually create workers that are pushed into precarious positions. For example, through visa restrictions, but not just that, through lack of access to benefits, etc., etc., etc. And all of this exists within a much wider context of proliferating precarity and the retreat of unions and class-based collective narratives from public life. Bradley's book, Fractured Identities, is important. Obviously, Zygmunt Bauman's work is something that we can draw upon. Mark Fisher, Guy Standing, although I disagree with his thesis on precarity, but it's a good foundation to sort of see the changes that have happened in the West in terms of access to security and people's identification with jobs and people's identification with the working class. This does not mean that people do not perceive themselves as working class. It does mean, however, that the move from perceiving yourself as a member of the working class to actually organizing as a member of the working class, this link has been severely severed. It's the basic distinction of, that was written by Marx, for itself, in itself, etc. So how does this relate to Scotland? Migrants figure heavily in elementary occupations based on the last statistics, which were in 2019. 16.5% of tourism, of workers in tourism, 29% in food manufacturing, 14% in hospitality. Why are migrant workers pushed into these occupations? Many, many reasons. One of them is de-skilling, which is not, I'm not borrowing the term from Braverman, I am borrowing the term from Reki and Triadafilidou, basically the non-recognition of foreign qualifications. Many people might have amazing qualifications, but they are pushed into specific jobs. But also, there are specific cultural dynamics that are created when a population becomes associated with a specific job. So, for example, this was heavily present in my research because of the way that I look. I was immediately put by agencies into jobs that had other Polish workers, which were white, bald, you know, and had a specific sort of way of moving and speaking, etc., etc., etc. Agencies are very, very important in both introducing migrant workers to the labor market, and also socializing migrant workers. Socializing in the sense of teaching them what to expect from their job experience in the UK. Quick word on employment agencies. Employment agencies are basically, they establish a triangular relation between the worker and the place of the place where the worker is. So if I am a worker, I will access a job through Dave to work in Kat's factory. My contract is with Dave. Kat simply tells Dave whether I am a good worker. This is a term that we will see a lot. Whether I am a good worker, whether she needs my labor, how much, what should I change, and if I am not good enough for Kat, Dave has a big pool of other workers that can easily replace me. And anything that happens between me and Kat during my work with Kat does not concern Kat. It concerns Dave. And of course, migrants' subjective needs upon arrival interact with employers' demands for flexibility. Migrants are not, just passive receptacles of oppression. People have specific priorities. You need to come to this country, you need to make money, you need to establish yourself, you need to feed your children, you need to make some money in order to then, access a college degree or a university degree, whatever may be the reason. The reality is that a lot of migrant workers, especially if you don't have a rich dad, come to the UK, and one of the first occupations that they find are precarious occupations. And of course, this neatly interacts with employers' demands who need flexible workers without rights, etc., etc. I'm sure that most of you are aware of this theory, so we can move on. So, after numerous attempts to organize migrant workers, myself as a migrant worker, I came to realize that obviously, despite their important structural position, examples of migrant unionization in the UK are rare. I started reading together with a collective that I was a part of, Bridget Anderson, Gabriella Alberti, Satnam Virdi, a lot of theory has been produced. I found that the majority of the literature has problems. The literature is split into two strands generally, union-oriented and migrant-oriented. So some theorists are looking at what unions do or do not do to help or encourage migrant organization. Some other theorists are looking at the subjective condition of being a migrant. So for example, the desire for a quick job, or what we call the dual frame of reference, where you favorably compare your current situation to the one you left behind. So, in Greece, the average wage is 700 euros a month. Here, you get much more. So I would, rather put my head down and work here, rather than go back. This is the dual frame of reference. So this is like the main split that exists in the literature trying to explain migrant unionization or the lack thereof. Either unions are doing something wrong, they are not intersectional enough, they don't collaborate well or whatever, or it's explained by the aspects associated with a migrant condition. I found also that the majority of the literature does not actually speak to migrant workers, which for me was incredibly problematic for obvious reasons. They would speak to union officials, they would speak to agency staff, etc., but they would not actually speak to migrant workers. Then I also found that the literature that included the voices of migrant workers and was also concerned with the issue of unionization focused on existing successful campaigns. Most probably, the majority of this literature focuses on London, where the Latin American cleaners have done amazing things. But I wanted to understand what explains the lack of campaigns. So it was not enough for me to focus on the success stories, which are massively rare and are not representative at all. I wanted to find out what explains the lack. I found that I presumed that a big factor in creating these sort of gaps in the literature is the distance that academics have from the actual context that they are exploring. I also found a lack of understanding of the nuances of precarity, migration, and work, particularly in terms of the embodied aspect of work. What it means to be tired, what it means to be exhausted, what it means to have to continually overexert yourself and work with arthritis in order to maintain a job. This does not exist. Maybe there are like 5 articles about the UK where this is mentioned. So I wanted to understand the relationship of structure, precarity, precarious contractual relations, juridical pressures, etc., 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 and subjectivity, what we come to the UK with, what we carry inside us, how this thing connects to our experiences, and then how do we operationalize it or rationalize it in our heads, and to what extent this thing can lead to resistance. And what I wanted to do was develop theoretical tools that will be useful for social movements wishing to organize with migrant workers. So I didn't want to just have an abstract academic sort of experiment. How did I do this? Obviously, my previous history as a migrant worker and union organizer helped. I conducted, this is the formal part of the research, because the informal part of the research obviously spans almost 10 years now. Actually, more than 10 years, damn. So I conducted 21 in-depth semi-structured interviews with migrant workers, and I also conducted a covert ethnography of 6 precarious workplaces in Glasgow. This was, so basically I found work as a worker, which I was already doing, but now this became under the context of the PhD. So this was in manufacturing, food production, logistics. Logistics was in one of the biggest companies of the world, with a guy that has a pretty similar, owned by a guy that has a pretty similar hairstyle as I do, and who has a heritage from the same country that I am from. Okay, hopefully you understood. And also hospitality. The reason I chose to do this covert ethnography, which is not, you know, a very widely accepted method in sociology, is because I wanted to triangulate the interviews and the literature. I wanted to find nuances that would not arise from the interviews. The corporeality aspect is extremely important. Obviously, there was the issue of access to workplaces and access in workplaces. So obviously, if I went to this company owned by my compatriot, and I said I want to research how you're exploiting your workers, that would be problematic, so I had to actually go there. I wanted to avoid reactivity. This is very, very important. I wanted to see people's unfiltered interactions, the jokes that we make with each other, the aggression that we have. For example, twice I was almost involved in a fight when I was working in the kitchen. And of course, this comes under the rubric of what Calvi called naturally occurring data. So the things that people do when they do not know that they are being observed. Why? Because I wanted to see subjectivity. I can talk about this more later, but we're moving on. So, and I will skip past this slide quite fast actually, because I'm already running a bit over. So, I found that we should not speak about precarity generally. There is a continuum of precarity. Verbal contracts, 0 hours contracts, agency labor. All of my participants, despite the massive differences between them, all of them, it was the first jobs that they accessed in Scotland were precarious occupations. All of them reported contractual insecurity, unclear and long hours, obviously the demand to be flexible, overexertion, and isolation. They also reported various instances of mistreatment at work, which they directly attributed to their status as foreigners and as migrants. So there is a very critical awareness that these things are happening because of our status as migrants. High levels of stress, insecurity, physical problems directly connected to their employment. So, for example, I spoke to one lady from Romania whose shoulder kept on getting dislocated when she was working in a hotel, but she kept on just popping it back in and working because she had to feed her children until she couldn't actually use her arm anymore. Like the socket became completely destroyed. And I also found that this idea that the precarious contractual relation leads to precarious interpersonal relations with colleagues, Bauman has written very beautifully about this, also Biffo Berardi in a 2017 book, I think it's on Infuturability. And these lead to individualist approaches to surviving in the workplace. And obviously this is underpinned by a very, very hardcore classic Marxian alienation. So, small example from the field notes. This was in this amazing, you can't actually read it. Amazing. So, the job is developing uneventfully due to its intensity and the atomized nature. You are alone with your handheld scanner, running the aisles or stacking shelves. There is almost never enough time to exchange words with others. Even the breaks are completely atomized. You only get 15 minutes of break every 4 hours, and you can take them whenever you want, essentially ensuring that people do not actually speak to each other during the break. There are cameras everywhere. You have the requirement to maintain your peak rates, which you see in your machine. This and the constant atomization combine to make you feel as if you're trapped in a virtual reality video game. You are pushed to work ever harder. I found myself getting stressed about my performance without anybody having told me anything bad about it. So you're constantly overexerting yourself. It's a Sisyphean task. You know, you're always working harder and harder and harder. The system is perfected to the extent that it does not require coercion or mistreatment by the management. You are already pushed into this position because of your class or migrant status, and you want to maintain a job that is in a clean environment and has comparatively fewer stressors than other occupations. The walls are covered with motivational slogans such as customer obsession and never be afraid to ask. However, you are compelled by the atomization, precarity, and strict mechanical regimentation to continually overexert yourself. And of course, this leaves no time or energy to care about your co-workers. Most of us were hired for the holiday period, and we know that we will be lucky to have a job after that. We have two objectives: make as much money as possible and try to secure the job. So you're working in a situation where you know that you will be fired, unless you are one of the 2 or 3 excellent, good workers that actually get offered the permanent contract. I have written about this an article for Roar magazine called The Rituals of Submission, Amazon's creation of the neoliberal worker. So if you are interested in more about that, you can go there. Now, this is a nomination that was present in the workplace where if you were nominated, you could nominate anybody, and you had to nominate them for a leadership principle. So this is customer obsession, deliver results, bias for action, and agile associate. So we see, you know, all of the things that I was talking about. And if you got enough sort of nominations, they gave you a little present. And later on, when I went back to that workplace, they used to give you a 50-pound voucher. Amazing. So this leads into what I call the agency arena, which is something that does not only apply to agencies, but I saw it really, really intensely in the context of the agency. By the way, in this previous workplace, the agency offices were located inside the workplace. And I also found this in various other places. So we have a spatial connection and a very, very direct, basically it's in your face. They don't need to hide it. They're saying the only reason that we're employing you through an agency is because we don't want to give you any sort of rights or any sort of permanence or any sort of security. But the connection is so direct that, you know, yeah. So what is the agency arena? 1 second. Obviously, employers require docility, flexibility, and availability, and the constant performance of the good worker stereotype. What is the good worker stereotype? Very, very simply put, it is the good, flexible, obedient worker, and it's massively connected to stereotypes about migrants, but also specifically about Eastern European migrants. And there are studies about that, where you will see employers saying that Eastern Europeans are more flexible, they are more, you know, they're more adaptable, they work harder, etc. There is a constant latent competition between workers for a limited amount of permanent jobs. You know that essentially you will be made redundant. So the good worker paradox is the knowledge that the better you perform, you might be progressively reducing your own work. And the metaphor that I use for this, if anybody has seen the Saw movies, one more is out now, where you're put in a horrible position and you have to, well, I don't know, like take out your eye in order to escape from certain death or something. You're progressively reducing the employer's requirements of you. But you cannot stop doing that, because if you do not perform to the utmost of your ability, Kat will tell Dave that Panos is not working hard enough, I want somebody else. So you're progressively working yourself into insecurity, into more redundancy. And you know about this. Now, precarity is used strategically by employers if then after employees have proven themselves. And I saw this in a radiator factory where I was working, where I basically got bored. I wanted to go somewhere else. I had stayed there for a month. So I told my manager, I was there through an agency contract. I was like, look, I'm going to go somewhere else. And he told me, no, man, stay here. You're a good worker. And if you really need to leave, I will give you a permanent contract to stay in this radiator factory. Now, I was there only for a month. There was another guy there who I call Victor, who was there for 6 months. And he had his agency contract just kept on getting renewed. And he was one of the best workers there. Why did the manager offer me a permanent contract? Because I said that I would leave. If Victor left, the whole place would collapse. But as long as Victor didn't actually ask to leave, they were perfectly happy to keep him in this sort of like massively precarious, frustrating, stressful situation. This is from one of my participants speaking about another print factory. There were certain jobs on the table. They would ask us at the end, every time we would do 100 books or whatever, to put a piece of paper with our name on it and stack it all together. By the end of the shift, there was this anxiety that you needed to have many packages done under your name to prove you are a good worker, working sufficiently in a fast-paced environment and everything. There was this indirect competition about who would do the most packages. So this leads to what I call the socialization of precarity. So we have the agency arena, this constant latent competition against your own self also. Lazzarato has written a lot about this. Again, another metaphor is, if you remember old racing games where you would have the car and then there would be the image of your old previous record. If anybody has played these games and you would try to chase your old previous record, this is something that you need to do. So Sennett and Cobb, now we're moving on to the actual gist of what I'm trying to say. Sennett and Cobb have written that to connect ideology and the people, we need to understand what happens to people when they wear badges of ability. All of these things, obviously you have the agency arena, which is the destructive and also productive, but it is the soul-destroying aspect of these occupations. But you also have actual humans that take pride in themselves, that do not want to feel like they are just exploited pieces of shit workers that everybody mistreats. And you start developing a very specific socialization. So I argue that yes, labor regimes regiment workers' behaviors. This is something that, for example, Alberti has talked about. However, this analysis does not go far enough. What exists is an aggressively penetrating socializing process that reaches deep into the recesses of subjectivity. It impacts what you think about yourself and how you think about yourself. Obviously, we've already spoken about individualization through precarious contracts, the competition for permanence, and all of this exists within the wider context of capitalist realism, individualization, precarity, Anderson's juridical pressures, etc., the lack of class-based wider collective narratives, etc., etc., etc. You reach a situation where your personal performance and relationships in work substitute your contractual security. If I can get Kat to like me, Kat will keep me in the job. It doesn't, that is my contractual security. How do I do that? Obviously, it's not enough to simply be a good worker or simply do the task. You have to continually promote yourself even more. Andrew Smith has written about everyday experience and their naturalization, and I found that this is a situation which over time becomes naturalized. You don't have a collective narrative telling you that this is wrong. You have a narrative saying that you are responsible for yourself, how much money you get, whether you will get permanent, whether you will rise to become a manager. All of this depends on yourself. So what do? You incorporate it. Bourdieu has written about necessity becoming virtue. Struggle becomes identity. So this is all tied to conceptions of individual freedom, competence, worth. What I am basically saying is that caught in these circumstances, I found that workers tried to rework the exploitation that they experienced into sources of pride. It became a part of the identity. This is from a Mediterranean restaurant in the center of Glasgow, and this basically encapsulates what I'm trying to say. By now, I understand that you cannot complain about the difficulty of the job. It's part of the prevalent habitus to pack her up, pretend like everything is cool. Later on, I hear George, the Scottish head chef. He was white Scottish, and he was the only Scottish person in the workplace. By the way, the kitchen was underground. All the migrant workers were put underground. We were not allowed to go to the main restaurant, not allowed to show ourselves. And the only sort of white Scottish person who was there, George, the head chef. The rest of us were Albanians, and Greeks and Albanians have a certain history, so they just threw me with the other Albanians. Later on, I hear George tell another worker in a loud voice, intended for everyone to hear, to never let it be seen that you are not in control. You might be panicking inside, but on the outside, you should always look like you are in control. And of course, you have to think about the context of these places, right? So employers are trying to cut costs. They are not employing as many workers as they need to employ. Everything is hectic. This is a central Glaswegian restaurant, like 300, 400 people per hour are being served. You're in the kitchen, there is dirt, there is spit, there is uneaten food, you are being burnt. I still have some of the burns from that kitchen. And you're in a constant situation of stress. Your body hurts, and this is the way that every day is. And the shifts are 14.5 hours long. At the same time, throughout these days, I am observing the frenetic pace of my colleagues and have mirrored it. At one point, another worker comes up to me and tells me that my job as a kitchen porter basically requires another 2 workers to function smoothly. However, he claims that you must have the ass to do the job, and that everyone in the kitchen has been through it. It's kind of like a rites of passage. But it's, again, this specific instance is really important. I was working, I had, there was water everywhere, just bits of leftovers all over me, etc. And he comes and he's like this, and he's like, yeah, it's really difficult, right? It's really difficult. And I'm like, man, this needs, you need at least like 2 more people to do this thing. And he's like, no, you need 3 people to do this job, but you have to have the ass for this job, you know? Everybody has been through it. This was the rites of passage. You were socialized into it, and if you were good enough, they kept you, and then you became a sous chef or a kitchen assistant or something else. But in order to keep you, you had to go through that. Bourdieu writes that habitus is virtue made of necessity. In this case, the inadequate labor conditions, where the company reduces costs by not employing enough staff, are entirely naturalized. Nobody questioned, why do you have to have 2 people, or why are you doing one job that you need 3 or more people to do? No, that was not even considered. You just had to be good enough to work for 3 people. Since these conditions are perceived as unchangeable, and since workers must constantly prove their worth, the focus shifts onto their personal qualities. The capacity to demonstrate their productivity becomes the measure of their status as good workers, opening up the possibility of permanence. Of course, we're struggling for security. At the same time, this extends beyond practical concerns. Overexertion and the capacity to labor under difficult conditions have become aspects of workers' identity. The scars, cuts, and bruises are no longer seen as bodily signs of exploitation, but as badges attesting to their strength and endurance. Suffering becomes a virtuous struggle that people have identified with. In this context, new arrivals in the kitchen either live out of exhaustion or an inability to keep up, which reinforces the core group's belief that they do have the ass, or they immerse themselves in the existing culture and, of course, partake in its reproduction. Now, what does this mean for solidarity? We're moving on to the practical concerns. This means that solidarity is itself intensely precarious. By the way, contrary to classic Marxian understanding, it's not enough to put people in the same workplace and have bonds of solidarity develop. You need a lot more stuff. We're dealing with fractured identities, fractured communities, spatial segregation, and of course, a temporal transience. You never know whether it is worth getting to know your colleagues because you don't know if you will be there next month, right? And also, practically, you cannot invest because you don't have the same breaks. Your breaks are not at the same time. Also, you are all working under conditions of precarity. So this interdependence does not breed solidarity. Actually, it may create enmity and frustrations. For example, when you're working as a kitchen porter, you have to clean the dishes. The dishes are sent to you by, they are picked up by a waiter who is also intensely precarious. What does the waiter do? They throw all the kitchen, they throw all of the plates, the forks, the knives, the napkins, they just throw it all together. Then it comes to you. You have to separate the stuff and put it into the washing machine, or some stuff you have to actually clean it by hand. If these things were tidy, it would make your job a lot easier. But the waiter is also under serious pressure, so they just throw it all together and then you have to separate the stuff. This reduces the time that you have available, so you start saying, you know, this fucking asshole worker like above me, why did they do this? And it's visceral, it's a visceral frustration. And then you see this person and you actually do not like him or her. You really do not. Similarly with my compatriot's job, you have pick rates, you have to stack the shelves, and you have to stack a specific amount of items per shelf per minute. Then somebody else has to pick that stuff out. Obviously, you're in a hurry to increase your pick rate, so you stack them not in the most neat way. The next person who picks them obviously has to struggle to find them. And there were times where even myself as a union activist, as an anarchist, I know all of this stuff and I know how it works. I was getting extremely angry at specific individuals who were not doing the job correctly and were making my life harder. So this is not a climate that is conducive to establishing bonds of solidarity. There was some forms of solidarity, but they were always precarious. It was always, I can take it up to here. I cannot go beyond here. So for example, in quiet periods where I would have to peel some potatoes, there was a guy who was coming and he's like, okay, man, I don't have anything, I will peel the potatoes. But this was only, it didn't reach more than that. Jonathan, who was a black worker, got fired, and I asked why, and it was simply that he wasn't working hard enough, or he wasn't fast enough, etc., etc., etc. And there was a complete acceptance. Like one day we were working next to Jonathan, the next day Jonathan was not there. What happened to Jonathan? Oh, you know, he got fired. Simple. So you also have the existence of weird forms of community hierarchies. Jane McAlevey, who is a trade union theorist, has talked a lot about finding organic leaders. In order to organize precarious workers, we have to find the organic leaders. And by those people, she means prominent people in the community. I found that it's much more complex because prominent people in the community, especially in conditions of precarity, will use their prominence to basically save their own ass. And this existed very much with Drago, who was the god of the kitchens. This was an Albanian guy who had massive amounts of cultural capital because he had grown up in Scotland. He spoke perfect English. He was the only person with a degree actually from college on cooking. And he was the one that organized absolutely everything. But he was also the one that was bringing other workers in through a vastly extended network of Albanians throughout Europe. So, you know, he had somebody's second or third cousin that was interested in going to the UK. Okay, come, I will put you in the restaurant. He was going, he was picking them up from the airport. He was setting them up with a national insurance number. He was finding a house for them. He was this like very paternalistic figure. Also, he was an extremely good worker. It was a pleasure to work next to him. Because he was not stressed. He was the only person there who was not stressed. But it was really, really nice. It was the only times where you didn't hate your life. At some point, I was on my last shift. I was having a conversation with George, the Scottish head chef, and he told me that, like, you know why these guys are so. I mean, I don't remember how the conversation started. Yes, I remember. George was complaining about his back. Even though he was very, very well established, he had security, he was still in pain. So he was a member of the chefs' union, and I told him, look, man, you know, you can bring your union inside. And he told me, look, it's not in my interest. And the only reason he said this is because he knew that I would leave the next day. He said, it's not in my interest to bring the union in. And then he told me the situation between him and Drago. So all of the workers' tips in that restaurant are kept in one box. And that restaurant actually has another 6 restaurants. So you work, you get some tips, whatever, they are put in a box. And at the end of the week, you would receive like £5 or £10, which were distributed by Drago. This happened with all of the restaurants. So George told me that himself and Drago, they received half of their wage above the table, and the other half of the wage came from the box of the tips. So this basically allowed them to make thousands of untaxed pounds from our work. And this is underpinned by Drago's amazing paternalism and his, his protectionism and his desire to get, more workers to come and work for him. So again, solidarity is very, very strange. This is just one example of how, community leaders are not as innocent as they might seem, which is also one of the main reasons that I am an anarchist, but the political propaganda will be kept for later. So, as I said, I found a very complex continuum of inter-exploitation and solidarity. It's not one way and it's not simple. And of course, I found that migration-based affinities do not equate to class-conscious solidarity. You have these ideas of like, oh, if we can just empower people, they will magically, see the light, etc., which is also a very, very elitist opinion. No, especially in conditions of precarity, things are much more cutthroat and Darwinian. Now, resistances. Yeah, we'll talk for 8 more minutes. We will stop at exactly the 50-minute mark. So I found acute presence of class consciousness. Everybody was fully aware of their status as workers. Also, some of my participants said, for example, you cannot be friends with your boss. Amazing stuff. But no inspiration for collective struggles, which harks back to the distinction in itself for itself. There was also an acute awareness of the connections between migration and exploitation. So I had many participants saying, we are in this position because we are migrants. Or, for example, a conversation that I had with somebody I called John in the kitchen. We were talking about migration and how difficult it is for him because he is from Albania, but he migrated to Greece at the age of 3. And then because of the Greek crisis in 2012, he migrated again to Scotland. And his dream was to work as hard as he could to get £100,000 on the side, and go back to Greece and have a cafe. Obviously, in order to make £100,000 on minimum wage, you really need those 14.5 hours a day of shifts. So I told him, man, isn't it difficult to be a migrant a second time? And he said, fuck it, man, we were always migrants. This situation has been again naturalized. We were always migrants. This is what we do. And of course, this is an internalization of neo-colonial relationships. Abdelmalek Sayad in The Suffering of the Immigrant has written a lot about this, another very important book. So there was a very direct understanding of the connections between migration and exploitation, but no desire for collective struggles, and the only exception was those with imported experiences of politicization. So people who were active in their own countries, and they already had this narrative. We will speak about narrative again. There was a lot of individual exercises of agency. So for example, Nicole basically said that she speaks out because she has nothing to lose. If I lose my job, so what? I find another like that, and she snapped her fingers. But of course, this actually reinforces the socialization of precarity. This does not destroy it. There were some instances of collective resistance, which I don't have the time to talk about. But for example, Susan, they mistreated her at work. She was working with her, basically with her cousin and with other people from her family from Romania. And at some point, she just basically said, okay, if you're going to treat us this way, we leave. And then they stopped treating them that way. But that was very, very specific. They were very, very important in the labor hierarchy. They had found a niche where, they were basically irreplaceable. And they said, okay, bye-bye. So I found that instances of resistance in this environment were overwhelmingly individualized and precarious. And the most important thing that I found is the complete absence of unions. You cannot inspire people without something inspiring. You cannot imagine something that you cannot imagine. In order to imagine something, I need to have a pre-existing stimuli. So there was absolutely no unions anywhere that I went, including some extremely important companies. My compatriot, another salmon-making factory that sells to M&S in Motherwell, a massive factory with thousands of employees. Out of 21 formal interviewees, only 2 had been formally involved in union processes. 3 recounted intensely negative experiences of unions, and also many people told me that they might have accessed a unionized workplace as agency workers, but that the rep never actually spoke to them. This is connected to ideas of agency workers and migrant workers being unorganizable. Nevertheless, everybody said that they want to join unions. And obviously my sort of conclusion, which comes from a good-hearted place because I am involved in union processes, is that before analyzing all of these subjective and structural factors that impede unionization, we should look at the inadequacy of our current social movements. And this is the main thing that I am arguing again and again and again, both in terms of social movements and in unions. It is extremely, we should be ashamed at how little workers know of us. So this is Leila. So I asked her, in all of her precarious jobs, she has changed like 20 jobs in Scotland. Was there ever a presence of a union? No, never. If there was, I would join. If anybody from any union would have come, I know I would have joined, unless it was a neo-Nazi or a super conservative union. But yeah, even Labour. So why do you think that there are so few migrants that are members of unions? For many reasons. Because unions are inexistent in our sector. They are never there. I barely see them. Blah, 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 blah. And any protest in this country about labor rights and 0 hours contracts and all that, they are not there. So basically she's saying something very important. You might see some protests, in Buchanan Street or something like that, but she's basically saying that the extent of the problem is absolutely not analogous to how social movements target the problem. So if they were more visible and they made more attempts to be inside the community and talk to workers, do you feel that the workers would actually respond? And she says, yes, because the anger is there. People are not stupid. They know that they're taking advantage of them. People don't have a distorted vision of reality. They know exactly what's going on, and they know it's not normal that people have to work fucking 52 hours to make a fucking living and to provide for their kids. So this is going towards the conclusion. Obviously, I argue that it's important to include the voices of migrant workers in the research that concerns them. I argue that the union absence from precarious workplaces allows this socialization to proceed unencumbered and perpetuates migrant marginality. So basically, the argument is very, very simple. Precarity produces a specific form of socialization which makes workers identify proudly with the position that they are in, with exploitation. It leaves no other option unless there is an empowering, inspiring alternative narrative. When we have not yet even created the foundations for this narrative to even exist, it does not make sense to think about structural issues and about subjectivity issues. That's 5 steps ahead. Traditional shop floor organizing is not enough to organize in precarity. Why? Because people are very transient. So you need to organize in the community. It's important for social movements to be embedded. Once this happens, because migrants and other marginalized populations have additional barriers, they don't just have precarity, it's important to have semi-autonomous structures that operate in an intersectional manner and allow workers to come as they are. It's important to organize workers as migrants and as workers. This basically means understanding the connections between the two. Many unions organize workers simply as workers, disregarding the specificity of the migrant condition. Others attempt to attract migrant workers by providing, English language lessons or something, basically saying, you poor thing, you're a migrant, come here and we will help you and we will also offer you some perks. It's important to organize on the intersection. And I argue, along with people like Lasos Karaliotas, that we need physical infrastructure such as social centers to counter the multiple intersecting factors that breed the socialization of precarity. You cannot wait for people to come to you, and you cannot just be chasing people around with a leaflet. Unions in the UK need to mobilize their massive resources, because we're talking about millions of members, to actually create physical community beacons where workers can access. And of course, because the socialization of precarity and capitalist realism extend far beyond simply impacting the lives of migrant workers, I argue that we need to work towards establishing dual power, and we need to really, really focus on radical hegemony, on overturning the hegemonic values that exist in society right now, instead of simply being reactive, which is the reason that we have set up interregnum.live, and I encourage everybody to check it out. This is basically it. And there is a bibliography here that you cannot see, but it's real sources.
Thanks, Panos. That was fantastic. And really, really kind of timely and really important set of questions. So we've got a good bit of time for questions. So yeah.
Hi. Thanks very much for your talk. It's been incredibly interesting. I could relate to a lot of what you were saying myself as a non-UK national studying in this country, working part-time, being very much right now in the middle of unionising at my workplace, which is one of the most visited tourist attractions in Glasgow with a 5.0 TripAdvisor rating, but which replicates a lot of the issues we were talking about seasonal contracts and zero-hours contracts being the norm. That kind of the pride in the suffering and the difficulty. Now I think I got back at 4 members of staff being let go legally because of seasonal contracts, all 4 of which were non-UK nationals, including a black woman in her 50s, which to me personally would obviously be immediate grounds for unionising, yet still I find a lot of scepticism in the collective staff, even though a lot of them are actually part-time university students. Generally everyone agrees with demands, but that kind of reticence to engage in anything, to kind of still to think that unionising represents an antagonising act. And I guess just as a side note, what I also really enjoyed was your remark about the sword films, because I happened to see that film earlier this week and had the same thought, that kind of the idea that the torture traps that the victims are being put in, and then the excuse for John Kramer says that I don't kill you, it's you kill yourself, and there's no option, you have to play the game. very much translates capitalist systems as well. That's just as a side note. My question is mainly going to be about your example of the printing shop of Legals in Bradford, how the attempt at unionising worked out there in the end, and what would you concretely suggest in the context of convincing workers in that exact situation that unionising is in their best interest?
So it didn't work. It absolutely didn't work. But that's the reason why I started studying all of this stuff, because it became obvious that just telling them. So at the beginning it was just conversations. This is wrong, blah, 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 we need to do something. Okay, yes, it's wrong, but what can we do? Okay, so I set up a meeting with the IWW. I was a member of the IWW back then. Okay, come to the meeting. I had a conversation with maybe 60 workers. 3 workers turned up. Slowly, you know, you have another meeting, and then it's basically the level of acceptance of these conditions is so massive that you need a lot of sustained organizing. So basically just dissipated. There was a small increase and then just a tired, fatigued resignation. The Angry Workers Collective have done a lot of work in London, and they have a book called Class Power on Zero Contracts, I think, yeah. Where they talk about many different experiences of the same sort. And if you're interested in answering these questions or seeing how they have tried to organize a lot of precarious workplace in London, that's a good book.
I think there's a question there.
There is.
Then a couple of other questions. Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Panos, for that really interesting presentation. I have two comments or questions. I don't know. The first would be, have you thought about engaging also in more historical comparison with what you described? You have described these kind of labor relations, and in a way they remind me, at least structurally, in perhaps what happened here in that very country maybe 250 years ago, before the working class organized itself. Very much like exploitative and individualized. So that may be fruitful in terms of going towards different directions or specific directions. And the second thing is, I would be interested in what you heard, if you heard anything about how these workers spend their free time and what their political attitudes are. Because I think that's quite interesting. And maybe the third question is, I mean, you want to overcome the barriers here, right? And you do that. You're a very practical-minded person, and I appreciate that. But then the question follows: okay, what do organizers and activists do with their very limited resources at their disposal? Where do they put their labor? What's your answer to that question?
Right. So, in terms of history, I've actually written an article about the Jewish worker struggle in the UK. From 1900 to 1914, it's uploaded on the Hampton Institute. It's called Organising in the Inferno of Misery. And there I basically say that they organized on at least a few fundamental principles. They connected migration with class. They established physical social centers. Actually, Rudolf Rocker, who is the founding father of anarcho-syndicalism, established the center, but the Jewish workers congregated around the center. Interesting small sort of historical trivia. This center, the Arbeiterfreund group in Jubilee Street, was one of the places where, for example, Lenin would go to have a coffee when he was in London, and at the same time next to him there would be, anarchists doing propaganda by the deed, blowing stuff up, etc. It was a very, very interesting point of congregation. The other thing which they were doing, which connects to what you were saying, about how do they spend their time, is that they were in that social center. They were organizing a lot of cultural events where people could actually have fun, which is why, again, in Interregnum on the 30th of November, we're organizing an anti-fascist hip-hop night. Fishman did a study where he was about the East End. The book is called East End Jewish Radicals. And he talked to people who were at that time 80 years old, and he asked them what they remembered about the social center. And what they actually remembered was the fun times that they had. They remembered Rudolf Rocker taking them to Epping Forest once a year, and you know, that this was their only time where they could actually have fun, you know, escape the daily drudgery and alienation, and actually enjoy themselves, dance, have a picnic, etc. That is what they remembered. But out of these actions, you ended up having huge strikes. And actually, one of the first instances where the local working class was connected with the British working class in the Dockers strike of London. Obviously, you know a lot about that. So that's about the history and how to spend. Okay, what do workers do? How do they have fun? Everybody's different. Like, I cannot, I don't know how to answer that because I work with so many different demographics, you know. Definitely, a lot of people are excluded from the dominant culture of Glasgow. So people feel that, you know, it is inaccessible, you know. Actually, one of the very, very interesting things that I found, well, I mean, it's not interesting if you come from these situations, but it's interesting in terms of the absence in the literature, is the connection between masculinity. Obviously, being a man, I had certain access to, you know, some sort of cultural narratives which are inaccessible if you are not a straight, white, cis man. So, for example, a lot of workers used to socialize. They used to go to strip clubs, etc. after work. So, you know, you're working for 14.5 hours. You finish at 12 in the night. You are tired. You will go. You will have a shower, and you will go to a strip club until like 12 or something, like until 3 or 4 in the morning. What is this? This is an attempt to recuperate the power that you lost during the labor process. You know, your identity is shattered. What do you have to rely on? You have your masculinity, right? And we also saw this inside the workplace. So, you know, people were joking about, you know, they were making small dick jokes, etc. Again, masculinity was a very, very focal point. And also a lens through which people socialized. Why is this important? Because if, for example, we had a conversation about unionizing and I brought my sort of activist friends to speak with these workers, the cultural distance between them would be massive. They do not have the same script. You know, this guy, this Albanian worker would make a sexist joke, and I was very, very concerned because there was one such instance where I tried to unite the two. I was very, very concerned that my union friends would immediately, you know, destroy that person for making whatever comment they made. So this was the third point. So the second point about time, about, you know, subjectivity. What was your third question?
The third question is what to do with the scarce resources.
Right. So the resources that the movements have right now in the UK, especially if you look big unions, GMB, Unite, Unison, they are not scarce at all. Because I have tried to get funding from them. You know, there's massive funding applications for tens and hundreds of thousands of pounds. So instead of making a festival, we could be focusing on directing these resources somewhere else. For other movements that do not have resources, I mean, in Greece, in Spain, in Italy, we are squatting social spaces. You have to fight for social space. Like, the resources are not going to come. The resources, you have to get them, you have to take them. And that is what many movements in the past have understood, and that is something that we have lost because we have become completely incorporated into the dominant hegemony. That's my opinion.
Sophie?
Yeah, by the way, amazing talk, and also, you know, it's hard enough organising the trade union here, never mind in a precarious workplace. So, no, I was just, it just kind of, this thought of mine, also it's been happening across Glasgow with Unite Hospitality, especially with 13th Note and the San Diego, and I'm just wondering how you think, if we're seeing people organising, and then in response we see businesses being shut down, how is that going to impact this kind of organising, especially in Glasgow, with precarious workers in hospitality?
Yeah, I mean, that's a difficult one. Obviously, you can't, that is a very, very difficult one. I have no answer. I think that you must create horizontal structures that will be able to support people. But obviously, You know, here in the university, you're fighting for pensions, pay, etc. You have to have that fight. If as a result the university closes, does that? I mean, that's kind of an argument that leads nowhere, right? Because they can always say that. They always say that economic efficiency stipulates that you should not do anything. Maybe the 13th note will close. But does that mean that workers should not organize? You didn't say that.
No.
But I'm basically saying that I don't have an answer. You just have to organize. Yeah. No. I think that's why it's important to have to establish this wider counter-hegemonic narrative, because it's bigger than just one workplace. So the narrative, as long as things are individualized, whether this involves one human or one workplace, the dominant narrative stands. Once you start drawing the connections and saying, look, it's not about the 13th note, it's about the wider structure of hospitality in Glasgow, and not just in Glasgow, actually this is hospitality all over the world, then maybe you can, make a more convincing argument. But this is not a good response. This is like one of the thorny issues which there is no answer.
Can I just sort of continue with that? Because I know some of the people who were in Saramago, and what I've heard is that, first of all, another cafe is opening up, and that I also have been informed that they are going to have different sort of working conditions. So in a sense, that action did make an impact.
Yeah.
And the other was that a lot of people who lost their jobs just ended up working for CCA. So again, the show goes on. It isn't the end all and be all. If a place closes down, capitalism will continue to reproduce itself, and may, in some instances, learn the lesson that you can't treat people in a certain way.
Yeah,
just to kind of respond to.
That's what I mean. It's like, what lessons can we learn from that? Yeah.
There's a question at the back, then I think there's a couple of questions.
There's Bridget here.
Yeah. But if we go with the question at the back, and then there's a question there, and then there might be other questions I've lost track. But if we go through those three, and then now,
Yeah, thanks. I was just going to ask, it's fantastic talk, and it normalized a lot of things that I thought, because when I came out of my first degree, which is my master's here, I worked in hospitality for my boyfriend who moved to Sky and said, it sounds lovely, but it was pretty rough, and a lot of the criteria that you talk about for precarity in the workplace, it's shocking, and it was either young students or Eastern European migrants. We were basically living on a building site, and we were living there temporary offices on the building site. That was the staff accommodation that we were paying pretty much for, and we weren't actually on minimum wage to begin with, and the list goes on and on and on and on. And now we're in the part-time food rest as well, and this is sort of beginning. It's similar, it's not as bad as that was, but I went to Scotland in mind, and places like Sky and Hebrides and these huge companies in the Highlands, and leisure and the amount of money that goes into these places. And often those ones that are exploiting their staff extremely badly, and places where we were living in a villa and with barely Wi-Fi, you come home from work late at night, you've got a split that starts at 7 the next morning, takes you an hour to fall asleep, and you do about work, and you have to go back to work. You don't have the time, the energy, the resources to come together, as you said, you're completely alienated. There's also no Wi-Fi or anything, let alone reaching out and finding a time to unionize. I don't know if there's any suggestions or anything to do with unionizing any places as remote places that physically as well as in all the other.
Yeah, so that's a very good point, and Scotland is incredible for that. There's also agencies, for example, that operate in Spain, which directly send you to somewhere in the in Sky or something like that. And that is this is one of the problems with globalized capitalism. So, for example, in these agencies, you have to counter these agencies, you have to organize also in Spain. This is the importance of creating internationalist links, etc., etc., etc. The places that you're describing, I had a few interviewees from these places also, and obviously a lot of friends, etc., that have worked in these conditions. They're the most difficult to organize for very, very obvious reasons. What can we do? We can create slowly a movement in the cities. And especially for these places, you need to be arguing towards legal changes, right? So you need to change the structure of the contract. You need to change the contracts that are allowed to exist in these places. So then a person such as yourself, who has the resources to contact a union, can contact a union and take it to a tribunal or something like that. Most of the time, actually, from my experience, the violations of labor law, I'm an accredited union representative, the violations of labor law that happen in places like this are very blatant. They are very, very easily winnable. Sometimes you don't even need to go to a tribunal. Sometimes you can go to small claims court. I've had tens of cases that I have won through simply going to a small claims court. So in those cases, for example, it's as easy as simply going there once and just talking to people, right? Having one contact there, bring us in, you know, at some point. There are a lot of ways around that. So there's like layers. The first thing has to be establishing contact, presence. Once you start taking care of these like really easily winnable situations, for example, you weren't paid £500, actually you will see that a lot of things start to crumble because all of these businesses are operating based on the fact that nobody will challenge them. This is very, very fundamental. This is not a theoretical point. This is an experiential point. Once you start challenging some things, then they get shit scared. So once you deal with those small stuff, perhaps you can create sort of movements to challenge even further up the hierarchy, but also we need to be focused on creating legal change. So, which is a very anarchist thing for me to say, but no, in terms of these very, very specific situations, you need to support movements in the city that will actually be able to say, for example, there is a certain category of contracts which are simply not acceptable.
There's a question there, and then we're back to that.
Hello. Indeed, briefly, actually, field work last week's conditions. That was great.
Hello, mate. Yeah. You've changed a lot.
So I really enjoyed the talk. It was great to see these issues through like this socialist lens. And I have just a question about the workers. So what is their what's their world view of where they are and where they're going? And by that, I sort of mean, do they see themselves in Scotland temporarily? And they're like, I'm going to rough it for 2 years and then go home? Mm-hmm. Or are they thinking, you know, I'll find a job with my degree that I can down with, but, you know, just 6 more months or something? Or are they planning to retrain as a, you know, maybe use the free university education pathways? So what's their sort of...
Mm-hmm. So first of all, when you're a migrant, you don't have access to free education in Glasgow. That's one of that's one starting point. In the literature, for example, if we go to Piore's classic Birds of Passage, 1979, Piore says that the migrant is the quintessential homo economicus, right? Because you're here for a few years, you want to make some money, go back home. And this is one of the main sort of tropes that feeds into the myth of unorganizable. They don't have an interest in organizing. Why? Because they don't want to stay here. They're not actually invested here. For some people, this is true. But for the massive majority of others, you don't actually want to go back because there is nothing to go back to. Like, especially now with the EU situation, etc., you go back to Greece. There is nothing in Greece. In Greece, people, it's not even safe to travel on the train. We had 56 deaths because 2 trains collided with each other. And that's not just Greece. That's a lot of countries in Europe. The main sort of argument that you will hear when you say, I want to go back to my country, people in your country will tell you, what are you coming back for? Just stay there. You're okay there. So yeah, the world view, again, Abdelmalek Sayad is important, the suffering of the immigrant. Obviously, I cannot generalize because everybody is different. But if we could make a generalization, I would say that it is one of dreams. You carry the culture that you have with you. You have a myth of what the UK is, what the UK represents. This myth directly feeds neo-colonial relationships and, you know, the brain drain, etc., etc., etc. So, you know, this idea that the country of origin has reared the workers and it's taken all of the costs of reproducing the labor force, but the UK benefits from it. So you have this myth that in the UK things are nice, things are good. And I heard a lot of these myths, and they exist in my research. If you actually look at the thesis, there's people believing that their rights are much better than they actually are, or there's people believing that they will make £100,000 on 8.21 an hour. So, you know, you have this myth, and then you have either a situation where you hope to stay and leave precarity. But this is where what Guy Standing called the precarity trap comes in, because the pressures of your life, not just the work pressures, in general, the life in the UK is much more difficult than simply I will work hard, get a job, and move on. So you either, the vast majority of people stay in these occupations, some manage to get some permanent jobs, some manage to become managers or something, but the vast majority just juggle between different precarious occupations. But the dream is that I will achieve my status as an individual. I will manage to make something for myself, you know?
Thank you, Panos, for a very important talk and a very theoretically significant talk. I wanted to move the discussion on to something a little different. You referred in your abstract about doing covert research. For those who are not sociologists in the room or anthropologists, covert research is where you do not announce that you are doing research. This means that you cannot ask each individual person whether they give you permission to interview them or to report their speech. When I first came into sociology, covert research was done fairly frequently. But suddenly, in the 1980s or 90s, a big ban was put on covert research. And if you look at the Association of Social Anthropologists, they say, I'll be very brief, covert research is only acceptable in rare instances where research is conducted in profoundly hostile contexts, where revealing their presence might endanger the anthropologists or other people's lives. This means there has been very little covert research, and yours is an extremely interesting example of that. I wanted to ask you the question, does this ban on covert research help Labour most or capital most?
I think that the answer is very obvious. Obviously it helps capital. I mean, with Andy, we had a very interesting few months trying to get ethical approval for this research in the university, and we had to create various checks and balances, which is, for example, ensuring the anonymity of the workplaces, etc., 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 which is why I'm referring to the person who is my compatriot and has the same hairstyle as I do. One of the other crazy things was, for example, and I don't know if you remember this, Andy, when we were dealing with witnessing harm. So in the past, I have been involved, I have worked with next to people who have had literally their hand chopped off. And the university was trying to get me to agree that if something like this happened, I would not report it for the sake of anonymity and for the sake of ensuring, you know. So obviously it helps capital in a very, very direct way. But I think that this is something that we can push against. And there is a very rich tradition also of what we call workers' inquiry, which I'm sure that some people here know about, where workers themselves are doing research as workers in their workplaces. And that is a very nice little cheat code, because many of these workers later became theorists, the Italian autonomists, etc. So we can say that, look, you know, I'm not doing covert research, I'm doing, you know, workers' inquiry following, you know, Tronti, etc. So that's maybe an answer.
So there's the question about and then Mike. It might be useful if we could take a few questions actually, because otherwise I'm not going to get things in. So there's I think at least 4 questions, which is maybe start at the back, then Callum, and Mike, and then
I was wondering if you noticed some difference in Brexit and how this is changing kind of the labour market of the people coming, and also related to that, how is this right-wing ideology spreading across the EU and creating kind of an idea, like recreating this romance of going back home. I talked to some Hungarians about this, and Italians, and I've been noticing a lot of this, let's get out of here, let's go back home. So this kind of romanticism is I hear a lot of this, and I wonder if you come across anything.
Right, so
I'm going to take a few, if that's all right. So then, Callum.
I might actually say mine that I'll just quickly. I'm actually really interested in the use of like religious language in some of the titles of your articles. Infernal, rituals, even the idea of an interregnum, the different kings. Like, I'm interested in like kind of following on from this kind of right-wing sweep coming through, and I guess the right, and particularly sort of all this sort of their happiness to engage with like beliefs and values, and the role of that within this. So, but I think it'd be. I think I'd probably rather have like a longer conversation with that another time. So.
Shoot me an email. We'll go for beers.
Mike.
A few years ago, Ken Loach made a film written by Paul Laverty, about a janitor strike in Los Angeles. The janitors were all from Central America, and from Salvador in particular, which at that time was in a state of extreme civil war, but had also just experienced a long period of high levels of mobilization, huge demonstrations against the government, and so on. Anyway, in the strike, the way it's represented, and I don't mean to be rude to somebody I respect very much, Paul Laverty, who wrote it, but I did talk to him about this because they're represented, these janitors, as innocents. And as per usual in films of this kind made in America, consciousness comes from the outside, usually in the form of a well-meaning left-wing student from New York, which is exactly what happened. So this guy arrives and says, I'll organize it. It reminded me of another film, I don't know if you know, called Norma Ray, with Sally Field in it, which is about organizing in a factory in Mississippi. And yet again, it's a New York student who arrives with the news. In other words, trade union consciousness comes from outside. What strikes me, and something you said as well, just now, when you said the migrants come and they come away from their countries and there's nothing back there, there's nothing to go back to. But actually they all come from communities which have their own collective memory, which is a very important element. You mentioned social movements. We can't understand why social movements arise unless we look at the traditions out of which they come, which very often, confusingly, are not informed by the ideas of the left, are not informed or started by the organized left, but as a result of a kind of a different tradition of struggle and resistance. Now that element, when you're talking, and you're completely right about the need to build a narrative, or as Sarah would call it, a myth, to drive movements, one important element of that is people's collective memory, their collective memory. So it seems to me that any exploration we do should also explore the background of the world from which they have come, not treat it as absent, not treat it as disappeared, but realize that there are elements of a consciousness, of resistance, which can and should be mobilized.
And then there's a final question back here.
So it's like 2 minutes. Do you want me to say that and chat afterwards?
Do I have only 2 minutes? We can go a little bit over, no?
Go ahead. Yeah.
Okay. I've got another question about the contemporary practice of workers in careers organizing tool.
Sorry, can you repeat?
But I'm going to ask that to you later.
Okay.
Just really quickly, I'd love you to talk a bit more about social centers and kind of social infrastructure around labor organizing. I've got some comrades in the Bay Area who organize Amazon distribution warehouses, and part of organizing that are recognizing it, and they're called Amazonians United, and a lot of their successes or the
scratching and get is around what we think of as like social reproduction claims, right? Like rent, transport, care responsibilities. And I'd like to hear a bit more about how that fits in.
Brilliant. Cool. So, apologies if I don't answer a question as specifically or as directly as I would have if I didn't take 4 questions at once. So in terms of the first question on Brexit and romance of going back home. My research was conducted after Brexit, but before Brexit actually was implemented. So my research finished in 2020. So obviously I could not see the changes of Brexit. Legally speaking, obviously I'm not going to say anything profound. Things have become even worse. So the juridical pressures which EU workers at least did not have, most of my research focused on EU workers. Why? Simply because we could understand the issue of subjectivity and migration without having this extra massive monster of, you know, the threat of deportation, etc. Now you have that, and you also have the visa restrictions, and you also have, you know, the demographics of who is coming to the UK is slowly changing. Precarity is the same. And also there is a very large population of people who have settled status, like I guess you or I, but where you don't have. Okay, amazing. Well, there you go. So, you know, there's a very big population though that do, and these still are the majority that are, you know, that are in precarious occupations, etc. In terms of the romance of going back home, I actually saw the opposite. So I guess, you know, if you're talking to Hungarians or something, obviously there is a very, very, you know, significant specificity there because we're talking about, you know, the country of Orban. I found, however, an importation of fascism, and as a member also of the anti-fascist movements in Glasgow and in Greece, you have, and yeah, you see this a lot. So, for example, you see Polish people who are fascists, very, very strongly, very, very proudly fascist, bringing their comrades from Poland and, you know, participating in fascist demonstrations here with national action, etc., etc., etc. We have seen people from Ukraine bring Nazi fighters from Ukraine over here. Last time, significant time was in Newcastle in some 2017 or something like that. The myth of going home always exists. The issue is whether this is something that is possible, feasible, or desirable for the majority of people. Maybe for hardcore fascists it does, but for most people I have seen that, you know, they create communities here, they create networks here. Networks also means access to specific jobs, like I mentioned with Drago. So if one person is here, it's easier for them to bring somebody else. Slowly, slowly you create a shell of your community inside this context. And this actually is conducive to fascism. And also the Greeks did that in Astoria, like we are one of the most proudly fascist immigrant communities in the world. So, religious language, rituals, and imagination. Why do I use them? I use them very, very specifically. First of all, interregnum, I use it, we use it, it's a collective. It's taken from Gramsci. It's not taken from, you know, the Divine Right of Kings. It's taken from the old world is dying and the new world is struggling to be born. In this interregnum, a great variety of morbid symptoms appear. But I do use a lot of, so for example, rituals. The article that I wrote for Ormag is called The Rituals of Submission. Because in that place, every once a week or something, we would they would gather us together in the canteen. We would put our scanners on ambient, not on ambient, on admin, which basically means that the administrator has told you, do not move. So it's fine to not move. You don't have to maintain your pick rate. And we would sit around, they would buy us burgers, etc. And they would announce the one person who has received a permanent contract. And they would say, Panos received a permanent contract because of unwavering commitment to, you know, employee excellence, etc. You would see some weird stuff. For example, we used to have an indirect competition about who would find the most expired items on the shelf, you know, because, you know, customer satisfaction. So that person would receive a contract. We would all happily cheer for him. It was the one moment of like solidarity or communal sort of existence. that's a ritual. That is very, very directly a ritual. Cheers, mate. So I use it for that because subjectivity is forged through rituals. And we also use this in the left when we have our protests, when we have our 30th of November hip-hop anti-fascist gig, people coming together. But yeah, this is a ritual also, right? And I also use a lot of this language because I want to reclaim the imaginary. Harking back to Castoriadis. We cannot allow the imagination to be given to the right wing. In terms of traditions of resistance, so again, I haven't mentioned his name as much as I want to. Abdelmalek Sayad says that migrants are also emigrants. And that's one of the main sort of, the most potent aspects of that book, The Suffering of the Immigrant, is that migrants are also emigrants. So it's important to understand what histories, what traditions you carry within you. However, it is obviously impossible for a social movement in Glasgow to trace every single migrant community and create a strategy that caters to every specificity, which is why I'm talking about social centers in the community, which will allow people to come and create their own sort of narratives or, recreate their own narratives. We need to give resources to people in order to be autonomous. Social centers. Fine. Janice Fine has written a lot about social centers in the United States. Can you repeat your question? That's the one sorry, I'm trying to keep a lot of stuff here.
Oh, yeah. No, you're doing great. It's a lot. I suppose the question is around organising around something like a logistics warehouse through political claims around social reproduction rather than direct organisation of labour in the workplace.
Right, so for example, with migrant work, right, I fully agree with this method, but I think that class should never be neglected. So there is a danger of, because we're very, very conscious at the problems that have emerged by our over-reliance on class-based frameworks, there is a danger of now completely neglecting class. This is a class issue, everything is a class issue. The same way that everything is a gender issue, and that everything is like, a race issue, etc. But class is very, very important. However, especially for migrant communities and especially for marginalized communities, the reproductive aspect many times makes it impossible to actually think about class. So for example, if you haven't sorted out your housing situation, how are you going to organize, in your workplace? If, for example, you are a woman with like loads of caring responsibilities, etc., and you haven't sorted that out, obviously you're not going to risk, anything in order to organize for your class-based grievances. That is one of the reasons why I'm arguing for social centers and beacons inside the community that can actually help. So we need to work on both ends.
Thanks everyone, and thanks for the questions. Thanks again, Panos.